the idea that the feasts of the Lord, for example, have an impact on our spiritual development, our spiritual growth, really is something that's foreign to a lot of Christians. And so tell us a little bit about why. Why are the feasts important, for example? Tell us some examples of how they speak into our lives as believers.
Well, for example, the writers of the scriptures, of course, being the people of Israel, they observed the feasts of the Lord. And so there are certain issues that arise in the scriptures that we really can't fully understand until we understand the biblical calendar. Two examples come to mind. The first, of course, is the issue of the Lord's Supper. Mm-hmm. This has been a centerpiece of the Christian world, both Catholic and Protestant, for almost 2,000 years. We miss the richness of what Jesus was doing at his Last Supper if we miss the fact that it was a Passover meal. Yes. And if we don't deeply understand the Passover and understand how it was commanded to the people of Israel to celebrate, and even how Jews celebrate it today, we don't understand why he took that bread. That was not supermarket bread. It was the unleavened bread from the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It was the bread of Passover, the bread of freedom. And it was that bread that he broke and identified it with his body that would be given for us. And many people don't realize that there are 4 cups that are taken during a Passover meal. And each one of them has a particular theme attached to it. And the 3rd cup is taken after the meal, and it's known as the cup of redemption. And the New Testament captures that and says, after supper, he took the cup. Okay, yeah. So to the writer of that scripture who was sitting at the table, it was significant that it was that particular cup after the meal, the cup of redemption. And he identified that cup with his blood that would be shed for the atonement for the sins of the world. And that he was identifying himself with the Passover lamb. And the blood would be the signal for God to pass over those houses, and that death would pass over the houses of the people of Israel who were in obedience to God's instructions. And so this is the heart of Holy Communion. It's the heart of the Lord's Supper. And what we get sometimes in some churches is simply a silver chalice or a plastic cup of grape juice and a thin wafer. Mm-hmm. At least that was my experience growing up in a traditional Christian church. And it wasn't until I understood the feasts of the Lord and began to appreciate and celebrate some of them that I began to understand. Another instance would be the day of Pentecost. In Jerusalem, it says, when the day of Pentecost had fully come. Mm-hmm. And if we understand that Pentecost is really Shavuot, it's the Feast of Weeks. It's one of the 3 great pilgrim feasts of the Lord, 50 days after Passover. Right. And Jewish people actually count those days, 7 weeks of 7, and then the following day, you begin the Feast of Weeks. And now in the Greek, it's called Pentecost, and the Greek Pente captures that 5 or that 50. So the Greeks understood, the writers of the New Testament, writing that in Greek, would have understood this is the 50th day after Passover. And so when it had fully come, in other words, as Jews, they were counting those days. And so then it says there was this feast, and why were there Jews from all of these nations in Jerusalem? Because it clearly says, and there were Jews from all these nations staying in Jerusalem. If you don't understand that they were commanded, and every year the people of in the diaspora and the scattered around the nations would make a point that would be one of the times they would all go up to Jerusalem to worship in the great temple. So we miss the background of the day of Pentecost and why there were Jews. And so basically we fill in the gap and we say, oh, well, it was an international crowd. But really, if you read chapter 2 very carefully, you realize it was almost certainly all Jews except for a few. At the very end of the list, it says there were Arabs and people from Crete. But when Peter stands up to address them, he calls them brethren. He calls them men of Judea. Repeatedly, he knows he's speaking to a virtually 100% Jewish crowd. That's when the gospel was, the Messianic Jewish movement was really birthed. And the Gentiles, we Gentiles, come into the picture 8 chapters later in Acts chapter 10, when the same Apostle Peter, in obedience to the Lord, goes to the home of Cornelius, the Roman centurion, in the Gentile Roman city of Caesarea. So, the background, much of it is lost unless you understand the feasts of the Lord and have a connection to the biblical calendar.